Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson. It's going to be the first in a new series that's going to look at landscape sketching. So it sort of follows on a bit from the figure sketching that we were doing, or figure drawing, earlier in this term. We basically just want to kind of look at how you can get to grips with the landscape just using dry media, so like pencil or pen, before you actually attempt to tackle it with paint, which can be a bit daunting for a lot of people. So it's going to be a series of lessons going through initially various concepts, and then how you can apply them to different situations when you're sketching. This lesson isn't going to be particularly focused on technique, rather it's going to focus on two important principles which are good to get to grips with before you actually start sketching, just so that you can kind of arrange the landscape and the tones and values that you see in the landscape and the shapes into some semblance of order. Because landscapes can be quite tricky to manage in that they have a lot of things going on all at once. You don't necessarily know what to focus on or how to kind of encase everything in your drawing or painting, which is quite different from working from a still life or working from a portrait or a figure, where it's very clear what your subject is. You're also working with a lot more depth, which is quite a change from working indoors or with specific subjects that you're looking at closely. So the two things we're going to look at today, one's called Carlson's theory of angles, and that basically will help you to think a bit about, or think more clearly about, how the landscape is interacting with the light source, which is generally the sun. And the second thing we're going to look at is something called aerial perspective, which only really occurs in landscape painting. It's something that occurs over very long distances, so you don't ever see it in portrait or still life or figure painting. But we'll begin with the theory of angles. I'm just going to go kind of through the concepts, and then we're going to do a little bit of drawing, kind of demonstrating how we might apply these concepts. So this first one, Carlson's theory of angles, comes from a book by an American painter from the late 19th, early 20th century, called John F. Carlson, and his book's called Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting. If you're really interested in landscape painting, I definitely recommend getting hold of it. One of the most useful principles that he talks about in the book, certainly when you're first trying to get to grips with landscape drawing and painting, is something called he calls it the theory of angles, which is used to group together various features in the landscape into large value masses. One of the most difficult things when working from a landscape is the ability to simplify things. Simplifying is an important kind of theme that runs through most of the lessons that I do. Life is always really complex when you look at it, or nature. The human form is complex, portraits are complex, the lives are complex, and landscapes are no different. The first thing you want to try to be able to do as an artist is simplify what you're seeing into something manageable as a starting point for your work. So it can end up as detailed as what you see in nature, but you don't want it to begin as detailed. So this approach will help you to kind of think about how planes in the landscape interact with the light source. So when I say planes, I mean exactly the same thing as when we talk about planes in portraiture or in figure drawing or painting. In that, if you kind of reduce things into a simpler form, simplest versions of shapes, you'll get planes. So let's say this is a little barn, something like that. It's got an upright plane, which is its wall, and then a roof plane which angles, another roof plane on that side. I've used this as a stand-in for a tree. It's a pretty simple tree, but let's say a tree trunk. So the tree trunk kind of is curved, and at some point it moves away from the light source. So our light source is kind of up there, so you can see the shadows being cast. On the ground we have more planes. As it's set up at the moment, we have this kind of flat ground plane, and then we've got an angled plane, which maybe is a hill or something like that. If I were to flatten this out, it all ends up flat. We can place these here. We've got a slightly different slope there. But yeah, essentially your landscape can be reduced to these sorts of simple planes. Now, how the planes interact with the light source affects how light or dark they are, as is always the case. So in a standard landscape situation, if you went out in the middle of the day in summer, the sun would be overhead, which is roughly what we have set up at the moment. I've got some lights just sitting directly over. See if I'm capable of moving them. I'm going to try to move them so they're a little bit more directly over the top of the scene. So I've got some lights just pointing straight down onto this cardboard. So all the cardboard is exactly the same value, so any difference in value that we see is purely due to how it relates to the light source above. Generally, there are 4 value groups that will relate to the light in a similar way, and it's just to do with their orientation. Or the last 3 are. The first one is the sky, which is the source of light. So the sky, whether it's overcast or a sunny day, will typically be the brightest part of your image. Very often when you have clouds, people make the clouds look really grey because they think of clouds as grey. But even overcast days, in fact especially overcast days, the clouds will be much lighter than the landscape below. In fact, they'll sometimes be lighter than a clear day, because on a clear day you're looking at a blue sky which has some value. Whereas if the sun is shining directly through a thin veil of white cloud, that'll be much brighter than blue sky will be. You can think of this if you see white clouds on a sunny day, the white clouds are higher in value than the blue sky. The reason that clouds tend to be lighter than the sky itself is because as light rays travel down to the ground, they either make it to the ground unimpeded, like on a sunny day, so all of the light that's coming from the sun hits the ground, or if there's a cloud or a veil of cloud over everything, so on a completely kind of overcast day, the light rays still eventually will reach the ground, but before they reach the ground, they bounce around inside the clouds. So what you end up with is a cloud which is glowing essentially because there's light inside that cloud. Now, there will still be light rays filtering down obviously, but fewer light rays filtering down will mean that the land is darker relative to the clouds. So on an overcast day, you'll generally paint or draw the sky as pretty much white. Now there are exceptions when you get heavy, dense build-ups of rain will cause like a much grayer cloud, but generally there'll be a part of the cloud which is lighter than the landscape. That's it'll give a dramatic effect to painting. It's a very nice thing to paint. Even if you had a semi-overcast day where you've got a bright ray of sun shining through the cloud hitting the ground that's being illuminated will be brighter than the cloud, but the point at which the light is coming from the sky will be even brighter than the ground, if you can see that. So the brightest point in a landscape will always be somewhere in the sky because that's the source of light. So that's our first kind of group of values. Our lightest values are in the sky. The second group of values, or value group, is the ground plane. So when I talk about ground plane, I'm talking about a pretty much flat ground. So when we first started, we had this set up so that we had I called it a hill set up. So you can see this plane is flat and it's facing just completely directly up towards the sun. Well, in this case the sun, the artificial light. So because it's facing upwards, it's one of the lightest planes in the image. So generally a kind of flat ground plane with a sun that's in a kind of normal place near its zenith will be the lightest part of the image, generally. Whereas we've got the same material kind of going up into this hillside, and that's darker than the ground. We've also got this this roof, which depending on which way it's angled is a bit brighter because there's a slight angle to the light. But let's say it's facing this way, something like that. It's maybe roughly the same value as the sky because it's quite flat. If it was more peaked, it would become darker. But basically any flattish plane, which typically includes a flat ground plane, facing up towards the sky will be lighter than vertical planes, which is our next group. So the next group are upright objects. So upright objects, trees, obviously. Sometimes you'll get people, for instance, in the landscape, or objects moving through. You've got buildings, walls, I should say, of buildings. So the wall of a building will kind of group with all of the vertical objects. Now, these vertical objects receive probably, I don't know, a quarter of the amount of light that a flat ground plane object will. So same material but much darker. That's because the light rays coming down are kind of slanting over these planes, and that it's not receiving as much direct light. The kind of more kind of below the light source it goes, the darker it becomes. The further away it moves and the more angled the light, the brighter it becomes. So you can see how the plane is changing depending on its relationship with light. Same goes for this hillside. It gets lighter as it angles down and gets darker as it angles up. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about theory of angles. So everything has a plane. Every aspect of everything in the scene is a plane. And all those planes relate to the light source differently, and that's what determines their general value. And the final group are angled surfaces, which you've already touched on a little bit. So angled surfaces would include hills and mountains, could be rocky outcrops, the roof of a building. So you see this roof is angled, say, at the same orientation as the hillside. It'll be a similar value. So these angled objects will maybe be, with a direct overhead light, would be somewhere in between the value of a completely upright object and the ground plane, which faces completely towards the light. So it's variable. Probably angled values vary the most because they can obviously slope down to be flat, or they can move up to be very almost vertical. So they'll vary a lot, but generally they'll group together. If you've got a hillside or something like that, you would unify them for simplicity's sake. So yeah, that's basically, these are our general angles. Now, there are obviously going to be an almost infinite array of exceptions to these rules that I've gone through, so they're not hard and fast in any way. The important thing about learning about them, or the reason you learn about them, is because it just makes you think about the landscape in a different way. So rather than thinking about objects in the landscape, so this is a tree, this is a house, this is a mountain, this is grass, or this is a flower, you're just thinking about how do these general forms relate to the light source. An obvious exception would be a setting sun. So if I set this scene up the way that it is at the moment, you can see how all the values work. And I'm going to just drop the light source down significantly so it's more horizontal, which is what happens during a setting sun. So it's now pretty much coming sideways, and you suddenly see a completely different arrangement of values. Because the upright plane, because the sun is so low, the light's coming in at a much flatter angle, the vertical plane suddenly becomes much brighter than the ground plane because their roles have been reversed. The angled hillside has become similar to the ground plane, and then equally, depending on the orientation of this upright plane, it would either be very light or could be very dark. So you can see there's a really big shift depending on the nature of the light source. So you have to be aware of where the light is coming from. You want to look for where the sun is. That's going to cause different relationships between these value groups. What's worth noting though is that the value groups remain the same. All of the upright objects will be impacted the same way. Any horizontal planes will be grouped together still, they'll all be darker. So their groupings stay the same, but the way they interact with light can change. Just going to move this light back up a bit. Get rid of the flickering. to our original light source. But yeah, that pretty much covers the idea of the theory of angles. So basically, it's to do with planes. It's to do with massing things together to simplify stuff. We're going to look at this in a moment when I'm going to draw for you and show how I would use these principles to group things together. The second principle we're going to look at just before I do some drawing is a bit simpler and it won't take quite so long to go through. And it's called aerial perspective, which you may have heard of before. Basically, it's a general rule that the further into the distance things go, the lighter they become. They also change colour when we're working in colour, but we're not going to worry about that because we're just working with drawing today. Basically, they get lighter as you look kind of horizontally into the distance, not when you're looking up into the sky. The reason for this is the atmosphere is full of tiny imperceptible particles or invisible particles that are invisible to the eye. Now, in a kind of normal setting, if you're sitting in a room, you're not going to see these particles. An example you can think of is, say you've got smoke or fog. That's an accumulation of lots of dense particles, so suddenly you are aware of them. But even when you don't have obvious smoke or obvious fog or mist, there are particles in the air. And these particles accumulate as you look at them through into the distance. So because the atmosphere isn't very high, so it doesn't go that deep up into space, but we can see 50, 60 kilometers, I think, into the distance. But there's only atmosphere, I think, a few kilometers, maybe 10 kilometers up or something like that. You can look through a lot more of these particles when looking across the ground than you do when you're looking up. But nonetheless, the particles are what makes the sky seem blue during daylight. So all these particles are being hit by light. They're glowing a little bit because they're reflecting the light off them. And as you look at things in the distance, well, I've got into this now because we were talking about colour. We weren't going to talk about colour, but as you look at things, they get bluer in the distance. So because we're looking at these white particles, they're white because they're being hit by the sun and they just look white if you were close to them. But from a distance, they start to look blue, which is why the sky looks blue. It's basically a thin veil of these white light particles over the blackness of space. And because they're further away, they look bluer, which is just a phenomenon of light. That's basically why the sky looks blue. So when you're looking straight up, the sky tends to be darker and deeper in colour than when you look across towards the horizon. So next time you see a blue kind of sunny day, have a look and you'll tend to find on a sunny day, the sky gets a deeper colour as it goes higher up. And this is because of aerial perspective. So that's how aerial perspective impacts the sky. When you're looking at objects in a landscape, so say you're looking at mountains in the distance, they also can look pale and blue in a landscape if they're far enough away. That's because you're looking through lots of particles that are kind of obscuring your view of the distant mountains. And so this occurs through the landscape. Depends how deep your landscape is. If it's quite a shallow landscape, you're not going to see that much of the background. It's not going to be as obvious, that effect. If it's raining, it's going to be more obvious because you're looking through more and more rain as you look in the distance. But basically, the further in the distance you look, the more particles you're looking through. These particles are light, therefore they make things look lighter. That's generally the principle of aerial perspective. You don't have to understand too much the sort of science behind it, but be aware that it's something to look for in a landscape. So you'll find your darkest values will occur nearer in the foreground, so nearer to the viewer or nearer to you as the artist than they would in the distance. If you put a really heavy dark thing right in the distance on a mountain, it messes up your sense of perspective, aerial perspective in the image, and it flattens things out, so it loses the depth that it would have if you can control your aerial perspective as things move backwards. So that's it for these two principles. I'm just going to do some little demos now using just some landscape references. I'm obviously not outside working from nature, so I've got some basic references to try to demonstrate these concepts. So I'm just working from my phone for this one. I'm not too worried. I don't really need a super detailed reference because I'm not doing a very detailed drawing for you guys. Try to keep them. Get 3 of them in. Maybe something about this size. I'd recommend that you use a pencil. I'm going to use a biro. Hopefully it'll hold up. I'd recommend you use a pencil for yours just so you can change things if you like. But basically I'm going to kind of block in an image based on those value groups. So the scene I've got is a kind of semi-overcast day. It's got a little kind of distant, if you can see it here, it's got a sort of distant set of trees. They're kind of sloping up towards the light. Then this ground plane, which is kind of slightly rolling but relatively flat, and some trees thrusting up near us. So you'll notice, even in this reference, what I was pointing out about aerial perspective, you'll see how the distant trees, even though they're not very distant, they're only maybe like a mile away, they are lighter than these nearer trees. If those trees were in the same place, they would be the same value, or if this tree was all the way back there, it would be the same value as those distant trees. It's just to do with where it is in terms of aerial perspective. You'll also notice that the brightest part of the image is the sky, followed by the ground plane. Then we've got our upright planes, these trees, which are the darkest point. And in between that we have that kind of sloping tree side. There is a little white building in the corner there. Don't know if you guys can quite see it. That's quite light because it's been painted white, so obviously local colour has an impact as well, which is one of the other major exceptions to the theory of angles. So a white building, even if the walls are vertical, is going to be brighter than the ground probably, or maybe the same value as the ground. In this image it's probably about the same value. If that white plane was flat on the ground, it would be a lot brighter than the ground. So it's all relative, and it all depends on the context of the plane. Equally, you'll tend to find grass is actually lighter, its local value, so the value of it, regardless of where the light's coming from, is lighter than trees. Trees tend to have quite the chlorophyll or whatever, and trees tends to be darker than in grass. Not always the case, but very often. So that kind of even further compounds the value of the trees. The other thing about the trees is, as they turn upwards, obviously the top plane of the trees is facing upwards, so that'll tend to be slightly lighter than the side planes or the bottom of it as it goes into shadow. So you'll see trees in the distance, probably won't draw this, but they have kind of little light tops on them. That's because they're facing more upwards, the top of the trees. But I'll get started. So if I was plotting this in, I maybe initially want to kind of establish roughly that distant hillside, just using straight lines, which is broken by that prominent foreground tree. So again, just kind of lightly blocking it in as a general shape. So I'm not really thinking about what is it as a tree, just thinking of it as this dark kind of blobby shape in the foreground. Then we've got our kind of foreground plane, which is quite flat, sloping up towards here, which then starts to block out that background hillside, which is a little bit darker. I've got a few more trees here. When I block in trees, I don't like to kind of think about what are they exactly. Just look for that kind of a regular shape. Trees will generally have some sort of regular shape. Just kind of quickly plot that in as a shape. It's a lot less restrictive than when you're working. So you've got this kind of raggly tree here. When you're working from portraits or figures, obviously you need a reasonable level of accuracy in terms of your shapes, because you've got symmetry through the figure or the face. You've got aspects of perspective that you have to pay attention to. All those sorts of things aren't so important when you're working from a landscape. You know, you can move the tree to the left a bit. The tree can be a bit taller. It can be wider. It can have a different kind of irregular edge around it. All those sorts of things are variable. Having said that, you want to look for the specific interesting aspects of the image. Just going to zoom in slightly on this. So you can see all the shapes blocked in, their initial block in. So in terms of where they fall in that scheme of planes, we've got, let's say, number 1 is the sky. Number 2, we've got our ground plane, which is the second lightest. Number 3, our hillside, which is the third lightest. And then number 4 are our trees, which are the darkest points in the image because they're all vertical. So, following on from that, we'll leave the sky just completely white in this image. We will ever so slightly, one way that you can do it is when you're adding tone, just add tone to everything all at the same time, and as you move into different planal groups, just stop adding that tone. So by doing this, we separate the sky from everything else. So everything else in the landscape is darker than the sky, as we decided when looking through the principles. So the next thing is our hillside is going to be darker than the ground plane, which is receiving the most possible light. Just have to get my phone back up. To be honest, it's probably not too important at this point in the drawing. So the hillside was nearer to us here and further away there. So what we're going to look for in the hillside is a bit of a gradient, getting progressively lighter as it goes further away. Now that's due to our aerial perspective. So a little bit darker here, getting progressively lighter. But that's it for our second plane. So that's the kind of far hillside that's a bit more angled. The final group, Massey group, is the trees, which are all mostly facing upright. Therefore, they're the darkest bit. This tree's a little bit further away, so maybe I won't make it quite as dark. It's going to be darker than that angled hillside, but not quite as dark as this nearer tree. We had some little shrubs in here which are also going to be dark because they were kind of angled vertically. Not quite as dark as that tree got. There's another little tree here which was pretty dark. See if there are any other small features. Yeah, there were some little shrubs here which are also facing upwards. And there was this group of trees which is also darker. Though again, it's a bit further away, so it's not going to be as dark as that nearest tree, but can go reasonably dark. So I could maybe reinforce this angled plane a little bit just to separate it from the ground plane. But still getting progressively lighter. You have some small shadows kind of forming underneath these trees. It's an overcast day, so the shadows are soft. I'm not going to quite go into why that's the case today. I'm just covering these topics. Next week we'll have a look at how shadows are affected by the type of light source. So all these trees are going to be casting some sort of shadow on the ground. But in terms of really simple landscape sketch, that's a pretty good start. You can go in and refine it. If you're working in pencil, you can refine it a lot more. You could make it bigger. Start adding detail. You can start looking at the specific shape of the outside of the trees, for instance. But it basically, that should demonstrate to you guys how those general principles apply. Hopefully the groupings were clear. the way they relate to the light source is clear. As I say, there's loads of variation, so if this scene was lit completely differently, it could be lit from the side, because it's a sunset. Suddenly this tree and this tree here would be dark on one side because it's receiving light from that side. They'd be casting kind of severe long shadows on the ground. We still have our background there, but the ground plane would be a lot darker than the sides of these trees because they're receiving direct light. The hillside might be a similar value to the ground plane. Again, these trees in the distance are going to be the same, so they're going to catch some light. But you can see it would completely change the value relationship. Well, not the relationship, it would change the appearance of the image, but the relationship would stay the same. So suddenly, as I was saying earlier, these the ground plane becomes darker. And the trees or the vertical planes become a lot brighter. So it's just to do with how everything in the scene relates to the light source. That's what we're thinking about today. So what I want you guys to do is you can go away and work outdoors from landscape, or you can look out your window if you've got a good view, or just do what I did and get some landscape references. Try not to look for like landscape photography because it tends to be really dramatic and quite complex to draw. Just look for like local areas near you that are farming, or look for a barn in a landscape or a pastoral landscape, something quite kind of mild to get started with. We just want to look at these simple concepts in terms of a tree in a field, or some mountains, or a hillside in the distance, or a barn in a field, something like that. Stuff that's manageable when you're first getting started out. These same principles then transfer to much more complex scenes, but you'll find it easier if you're working from this sort of scene rather than something super complex. But yeah, hopefully that was interesting. Next week we're going to start looking at some other phenomena that occur in landscapes. Looking at, as always, looking at how light interacts with objects and surfaces. There's loads of really interesting textures and surfaces in landscapes, so it can be quite different from what you're used to if you work from portraits or figures, but we'll leave that for next week. Hopefully that was interesting, and I'll see you guys soon.